All right, good afternoon and welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face. I'm Alex Lukowski, Assistant Vice President of Communications. Now, some of you are old enough to remember these lyrics from a 1975 reggae classic. Doctors smoke it, nurses smoke it, judges smoke it, even lawyers too. So you've got to legalize it and don't criticize it. Now, contrary to what you might think, former whaler Peter Tosh was actually pleading a very unpopular case there in his hit song, Legalize It. The federal government had just passed the Controlled Substances Act and created the DEA just a few years earlier. An NBC News poll showed that 84% of Americans opposed legalizing marijuana. We're calling it cannabis now. And only 4% said they had actually tried it. But today, according to the Pew Research Center, nearly 9 out of 10 Americans support legalizing adult recreational cannabis. And even several presidents and at least one Supreme Court justice have admitted that they've used it. 10 years ago, Maryland joined about 2/3 of the rest of the states approving the use of medical cannabis to ease pain, control nausea, even to induce a desire to eat. Dispensaries started opening in 2017, and now doctors, nurse practitioners, dentists, even podiatrists prescribe medical cannabis to thousands of patients each year. Now, last fall, Marylanders overwhelmingly, 2-1, approved a referendum making ours the 20th state to approve the adult use of recreational cannabis. The legislature is still working on the details, but essentially, as of July 1st, adults 21 and older may possess up to 1.5 ounces of cannabis and grow 2 plants out of sight for personal use. There are provisions to license growers, processors, and retailers, and others to address education and driving while under the influence, and plenty of other topics. Legislators are also working to promote social justice. Maryland has a long history of disproportionately arresting African Americans for cannabis possession, and the new law will allow the re-examination of the sentences of those incarcerated in part for minor cannabis possession, and allow the expungement of minor cannabis possession convictions, something that could adversely impact the ability to get a job, or to buy a house, receive a professional license, or even to get a student loan. Now, lawmakers also want to ensure that communities that have been the most impacted by the war on drugs reap a good share of the economic benefits. Some 300-400 licenses to grow, sell, and dispense cannabis could generate billions of dollars in sales and tens of millions in taxes and fees. Colorado and Washington State, for instance, already derive more tax funding from cannabis than from alcohol. It's noteworthy that when medical cannabis was approved in Maryland, none of the initial licenses went to African Americans. The new legislation will give advantage to those who have lived in disproportionately impacted communities and also provide mentoring and startup loans. Supporters say there are public health benefits too. Legalized cannabis can be made safe, free from dangerous additives like fentanyl. And cannabis is less addictive and less likely to lead to serious medical problems than alcohol. But there's still calls for caution. In a Washington Post column last fall, Lena Wen, you remember her, former Baltimore health commissioner and now George Washington University public health professor, detailed what she called abundant research showing how exposure to marijuana during childhood impacts later cognitive ability, including memory, attention, motivation, and learning. And Wen's not alone in this view. The United Nations International Narcotics Control Board's annual report says in all jurisdictions where cannabis has been legalized, data show that cannabis-related health problems have increased. The report also points a finger at certain cannabis-based products like edibles and vaping products, often marketed in attractive packaging for young people. And it's worth pointing out, too, that this is not, as they say, Woodstock weed. The concentration of THC, the main psychoactive cannabinoid in the cannabis grown today, is several times higher than in the 60s and 70s. And finally, I'd be remiss not to mention one other important legal issue, and that it's not entirely legal to possess or use cannabis really anywhere in the U.S. because under federal law, cannabis remains listed as a Schedule I drug like heroin, ecstasy, and LSD. The aforementioned Controlled Substances Act defines Schedule I drugs as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. And it's not just a technicality. The single fact alone has made it very difficult for universities like ours to perform meaningful research. All right, unless you're unable to see the program, you already know we have a guest host today, Provost, Executive Vice President, and Graduate School Dean Roger Ward. And joining Dr. Ward are Mathew Swinburne with Maryland Carey Law and also the Network for Public Health Law. He's worked closely with Maryland legislative committees throughout this process. And Leah Sera, Associate Professor and Co-Director of the School of Pharmacy's first in the nation MS in Medical Cannabis Science and Therapeutics program, now in its 4th year. Thank you both for joining us. For the audience, please remember our experts are here to answer your questions. So So please write them down and send them to me using the chat function whenever you like. I'll let you know when we're getting ready to come to you for your question. When we call you by name, your mic will be open. You don't have to wait and open it up. I'll open it for you, and you can just go ahead and speak up. And if you prefer to remain anonymous, that's okay too. Just let me know that. Now, please welcome Roger Ward.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, all. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in. I'd also like to echo Alex's thanks to my guests today, Professor Swinburne and Professor Dr. Sera, from this point forward, Matt and Leah, as they prefer, who bring a tremendous amount of expertise on this very, very complicated but highly interesting issue. Our audience is typically very diverse, so I'm not going to assume what the depth of knowledge is as it relates to each of our participants. So we'll try to make sure that the conversation has some breadth to it so that everyone participating could feel as though they're understanding and following the conversation. As it relates to the conversation, let me start by saying, as Alex noted, Maryland voters voted overwhelmingly to legalize marijuana, cannabis in the state. And so this conversation, we will not focus on whether or not that was the right thing to do and whether or not it's, marijuana or cannabis should be legalized. To some extent, well, not to some extent, to a large extent, in many states, that question has been settled. States have decided that it's the right thing to do for a number of reasons. Some of them we will get into today, so we will not rehash that argument here. Instead, we think it best to use the time to talk about the benefits and challenges associated with the legalization of marijuana, cannabis. And so that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. Of course, as listeners in the audience, when it comes time for you to ask questions, you could go where you wish with your questions, and we'd be happy to respond to them. But let me start first with a question to Leah. You notice in speaking, I kept saying marijuana and cannabis. And one very simple question I have is, what is the difference, if any, between the term marijuana and cannabis? Are those terms interchangeable?
That's a great place to start. Now the terms are considered interchangeable, but what cannabis is the scientific name for this plant. Marijuana is a term for cannabis that has a long history in the U.S. It originated in Mexico, and it was popularized kind of in the early 20th century by politicians as a way to kind of distance cannabis from its scientific and industrial uses and gain support for anti-cannabis legislation, which was happening at the time because there was a lot of concern about recreational cannabis, recreational marijuana use, and it really had racist connotations because there was also a lot of concern at the time about large-scale immigration from Mexico. So, as I said, really, when you read cannabis, marijuana, if you see those terms, they are considered interchangeable. I prefer to use the scientific term for the plant, which is cannabis. And one other term that I wanted to kind of define as we move forward that people may have heard, and that's hemp. Hemp is a term for strains of cannabis. It's not a different plant. It's a term for strains of cannabis that contain very, very low amounts of THC, which is that psychoactive chemical. And so those are three terms I think are important to define. So thanks for that starting question.
Well, thank you, Leah. That is very, very helpful. And since we're talking about terms and definitions, you already mentioned one, THC and hemp. And let me add another one, a third, that we hear about all the time, CBD. We've already talked about what hemp is. What is THC? What is CBD? What is the difference between those two things?
Sure. THC and CBD are examples of chemicals specific to the cannabis plant that are called cannabinoids. There are over 100 known cannabinoids. Many of them have physiological, activity in humans and animals. And the two, most, common, most commonly known, most commonly, studied are THC, which has, psychoactive effects. And really, this has been the most studied. And this is also called tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol, or CBD, is another one that does not cause these psychoactive effects. And CBD has become really popular because it can be extracted from the hemp plant. And so for reasons that we may get into later, we're seeing a lot more CBD products because they're easier to manufacture and sell, currently here in the U.S.
Thank you for that. So Matt, in preparing for this, I read a quote from a faculty member, Professor Jernigan at Boston University School of Public Health, where he said we're in a massive natural experiment in terms of this issue around cannabis, the legalization of it and everything that goes along with it. Are we in a big natural experiment, and where is Maryland in terms of this experiment?
Oh, I'm glad to take this one. I think that's a wonderful quote, because what we're seeing is because of the federal status of cannabis, we don't have the federal government creating uniform kind of federal programs. That's kind of the function in a lot of areas. Think of the FDA and their role in prescription drugs. Here we have each state addressing the issue of legalization and all the ancillary kind of policy decisions that are required. So you see each state developing different approaches, a lot of the times, to the same issues, whether it's the issue of product safety, youth access, social justice issues associated with this. And it's this, kind of term you hear, that the states are the laboratories of democracy. And we're seeing each state kind of develop their own regulatory approach to cannabis and cannabis legalization. Now, where does Maryland fall in this? Well, we weren't on the cutting edge of this policy decision. We're not a Colorado or a Washington or a California, but we have the benefit of learning from all of the states that have gone before us. So we can take from that the things that have been done right, that have addressed issues. We can learn from the mistakes that other states have made in terms of unintended consequences, and use those to craft our own regulatory system that will hopefully, as kind of we mentioned earlier, kind of maximize the potential benefits from legalization, as well as, minimizing the risks that accompany this type of policy change.
Following up on that, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about where the federal government stands on this issue. Because as a state, of course, voters have voted to legalize. There's legislation working its way through, and I'll ask you to talk a little bit about the specifics of the legislation in a little while. But under the Controlled Substance Act, which is federal law, it is against federal law to possess, distribute, produce cannabis. But meanwhile, to your point, states are going ahead and creating laws that support the use, distribution of medical cannabis and now adult use or recreational cannabis. And it just seems as though, to a layperson, states are setting their citizens up to violate, one could argue, federal law. How do you reconcile the disconnect? Is it that the federal government and the law enforcement agencies are looking in the other way as it comes to an enforcement of its own laws?
Yeah, there are a lot of legal kind of interventions in this area that kind of allow the system we have and this disconnect to continue. But the ones I want to focus on is this idea of enforcement discretion. And so I'm going to talk about two separate things. First, you know, the Justice Department under President Obama started this kind of, you know, statement of policy of what the federal government would do around cannabis legalization at the state level. You know, they released a, you know, kind of an enforcement memo saying, you know, we're deprioritizing, you know, going after medical cannabis systems and the people who are in compliance with them. And, you know, shortly thereafter, they released another kind of enforcement memo saying, you know, here are the things we're looking for that would drive our actual enforcement measures. Things like cannabis crossing state lines, you know, cannabis systems that have a link to organized crime or problems with youth access or, you know, diversion to youth outside of, you know, kind of pediatric patients. And so there was this enforcement policy, but enforcement policy can change from administration to administration. And we saw, you know, some rumblings around this under President Trump. But the real thing that is kind of allowing states to do what they're doing is that Congress, for a long period of time now, restricts the money that goes to the Justice Department at the federal level and says you can't use any of the funds we give you in enforcement actions against medical cannabis systems, the state's medical cannabis system, and essentially people who are in compliance with those laws. So it's this appropriations restriction that's renewed every year that prevents federal law enforcement from going after the medical cannabis systems that states are setting up. But, you know, those restrictions don't explicitly apply to adult use systems. But I think the adult use systems are kind of protected by the spirit of that appropriations rider. And really, you know, if you look at the degree of change that we have, I don't think the federal government is going to change course now that we have, 22 jurisdictions that have legalized adult use. So that's kind of the main thing that's allowing these two kind of oppositional systems to function.
Fascinating. Before I come back to you, Matt, to talk about the legislation, Leah, I'm just curious, as an educator, faculty member, program developer, director, how has the restriction at the federal level complicated your life in the education space relative to how the program has to be structured, what you could teach the students in the program? Will you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in our program, in developing our program, we worked closely with the Maryland Office of the Attorney General and our own, you know, university legal department to make sure that we wouldn't be running, you know, afoul of any of these laws and regulations. And what kind of came out of that was that, you know, we don't have any hands-on research or any interaction with the plant itself. So there's no cannabis, you know, touching activity, you know, in our program. We also don't, and so then, you know, we don't do research here at the university in general. And we also don't teach business practices. So we don't teach marketing. We don't teach how to grow the plant. But what we do teach is we teach about the science, so pharmacology, pharmaceutical science, the chemistry of the cannabis plant, how those cannabinoids and other chemicals interact with our physiology, what we know about the evidence for therapeutic use and what we don't know, and the risks and potential negative effects, you know, and then policy Those are all things that, it's didactic in nature, but those are all things that we're able to teach in our program. It's a pretty broad curriculum.
It's a very good response too, and quite informative. But Matt, what you essentially just said to me is, as a citizen of Maryland, who of course have been following the legalization, the referendum, and so on, and the legislation making its way through, that if I want to get into the business, I shouldn't be talking to Leah, because she's not teaching that in her program. So as someone following the legislation, as someone who has advised legislators, policymakers in other states about how they should structure their legislation, how does Roger Ward get into that business? Certainly as a person of color, but potentially as someone who's interested in the adult use cannabis market.
Oh, you want to be part of the cannabis boom? What news to me? Okay.
I
generally don't advise people about how to get licenses, but I can talk a little bit. I think what the interesting thing is, licensing and who receives those licenses is a huge issue. And it is really one of the key issues that states discuss in the decision to legalize. And I'm going to throw out some terms that I'll define now. This idea of social equity applicants is something that I'm going to discuss. And it goes to a problem that's a national problem, that the people who benefit from the cannabis boom and the money that's being made overwhelmingly look like me. When you look at who has ownership interests in cannabis businesses, it's disturbing. Recent studies said that they estimate that 2% of cannabis business licenses are held by Black Americans. Now, compare that to number one, kind of the demographics of the country, where Black Americans make up between 13 and 14% of the population. And you see the problem right off the bat, but we know that the war on drugs was a racist war on drugs and disproportionately impacted people of color. Even as we are transitioning our cannabis policies, Black people are still, I think it's 3.64 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than their white counterparts, even though drug use is comparable across racial demographics. And I could get into more of that, but so we have these two things, not in line with representation of the general population, and we have the kind of moral setting of the war on drugs and how that, there's a disconnect in the business. And so Maryland, in its medical program had some issues in terms of the diversity of folks who were receiving licenses. And there was a first round that was very problematic, and a second round where they increased the diversity in license holders, but those license holders have yet to be able to make their businesses operational. So Maryland has been very purpose-driven in this process to make sure that we have greater equity in our cannabis industry. And we're looking to provide, the legislation is looking to provide all of the first round of licenses to individuals who qualify as social equity applicants. And this looks at folks who have lived in disproportionately impacted communities, or have gone to school in them for a set period of time, or who attend higher education in the state for at least 2 years at an institution where 40% of the students qualify for Pell Grants. So it's great in that there is a specific goal, because a lot of states don't set specific goals in terms of getting licenses out. We also have, it's great that there's some other great things in the bill, like we have a social equity office that is going to take a leadership role. And, in the research that my team has done, we've created a social equity toolkit that looks at all the policy levers that states use to try to make a more inclusive industry, and having a specific body or individual designated as that equity lead is an important measure. And Maryland has incorporated a lot of tools, I think, this time around to be much more successful in diversifying the cannabis industry here.
Alex, I don't imagine you have any questions for us from the audience at all.
No, really nothing. We have a ton of questions, and they center on just a few topics. One of them is employment and drug screening, and particularly as it relates to people in the healthcare industry and social work, social sciences. I'm going to bring in Paul Sacco. Paul, do you want to ask your question?
We're just running into this more and more. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. Sorry. Yeah, the reason why I asked, I was curious because, we have current students who may be using medical marijuana, are graduates, and a lot of places that they go to work have drug testing regimes. And these drugs are in their systems for 40, 60 days, right? Cannabis stays in your system for a long time. I didn't know how you folks feel like legal regimes are going to change, what if you have thoughts about the policy framework for kind of dealing with that, since we really don't deal with alcohol like this, right? In terms of how do you figure out, is someone currently impaired? Yeah, those kinds.
Well, Paul, this is something that I have done work in this area with my law students here at the law school. And it's this idea of, we're legalizing cannabis. We legalized cannabis for medical use, and now we're legalizing it for adult use. Can folks be discriminated against in key determinants of health? I'm a public health attorney. That's how we look at things. These determinants of health are things that really impact the quality of our life. And it's things like employment, housing, education, parental rights. And here in Maryland, we have no protections, employment protections in place for folks who use medical cannabis currently. And there was a employment protection provision in the House bill and the Senate bill that looked at providing some employment protections for folks who were state employees or kind of local government employees, but not broader protections to cover private industry. And those protections were removed. And, these protections, and other states have these, goes to this idea of protecting responsible cannabis use. If someone uses cannabis on Saturday night and is not impaired when they go to work on Monday, they shouldn't be fired, the idea, but none of these kind of protections that we see in other states, or that were contemplated initially in these bills would allow someone to use cannabis at work or be impaired at work. And with any of these systems, there are exceptions to the protections. But I think it is a key part of cannabis legalization that Maryland really needs to catch up on in terms of advancing it. But I think it is a difficult policy to push. There are concerns like, well, is this a particularly safety sensitive industry? And do we need to make exceptions for that? There are some exceptions that need to be made for federal law for, companies that get federal grants or federal contracts. So it's a complex area legally, but it's something that Maryland really needs to tackle because there aren't protections for responsible cannabis use, even though we are legalizing this behavior in terms of kind of like private sector discrimination.
So
can I just follow up, because Ashlyn Delhagen had almost the same question, but she had another aspect that I think maybe you ought to address. She said she has complicated feelings about employment drug screens in general, but specifically for THC, because it appears that drug screens are inherently inequitable due to the way the body processes the metabolites. She's talking about the fact that THC is fat soluble, and it tends to work against people with a higher fat content in their body? So I just want to throw that into your answer.
Well, I don't know if Leah wants to talk to the science of it because, she's the scientist, but, yeah, that's a big challenge. Like, from my perspective, the big challenge is that a test for THC in an individual system does not mean, if they get a positive result, does not mean they are impaired.
Right. Yeah, and that's what differentiates it from, a blood alcohol test. We can, really correlate, blood alcohol level with impairment, and we can't do that with, when we do urine or hair drug tests for THC and its metabolites, because they're stored in fat and eliminated very slowly over time. They are stored in levels that are low enough that the person is, not intoxicated, just high enough to be detectable. And that can be, it's been reported that after a single, using THC a single time, you could have a positive test for up to 2 weeks afterwards or more. And for regular users, it could be, 45 days. And for chronic or daily users, you could test positive for up to 3 months after the last use. And so, yeah, that is, very different from other types of testing that we do for impairment. And, it is, something that we'll have to figure out, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Thanks for that, Leah. I was actually going to ask a very similar question, but which was basically picking up on what Matt was saying before. Is there a scientific basis for us to be concerned that someone tests with cannabis in their system, having used it, a couple of weeks ago? Is there really a scientific basis for being concerned about the person's performance? And I think you got at it with that question. Other questions, Alex?
One more stab at employment-related questions here. I want to bring in Maya Montenegro. Maya, are you there? Maya, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess my first question was kind of already touched on, which was I was also asking about the future of drug testing and employment. But my next question would be, in terms of criminal justice, there's obviously the talk about criminal records being exempt or being modified. But what impacts can we really see to BIPOC communities? Because the reality is that these folks have already been discriminated against based off their records, and that doesn't leave a person and a community. So what can we maybe imagine would happen to these communities, especially in terms of police activity, application to jobs, or social benefits?
Okay, I can talk about this a little bit. I think there are a couple things that are important to understand. And they're actually, I think, Maryland took some smart approaches. So the first thing that you alluded to was the expungement of criminal records. And cannabis possession offenses are eligible for automatic expungement under the legalization process, because we have to look back at last year's legislation that really deals with the expungement. But this means the burden is on the state to expunge that record, which means records will get expunged. Some states don't use an automatic expungement process that puts the burden on the state. They require individuals to petition. And studies show that when individuals are required to petition, you get, it's just a few percentage of folks who are actually eligible take advantage of it, because it is a process. It takes a dedication of time, knowledge, resources to get this done. So our automatic expungement is a good thing. Now, expungement seals your record, and you don't have to report that you have a criminal offense moving forward. Once that is sealed, it'll be sealed from the view, of employers. It will be, protected information. Now, that goes to kind of moving forward, but you've pointed out a lot of damage has already been done. And one of the key pieces of this legislation is how it's spending the tax revenue that it's bringing in. And between 30 and 35% of the tax revenue that's brought in, depending on whether it's the House version or the Senate version of the bill, will go to what's referred to as the Community Reinvestment and Repair Fund. And that's really focused on helping the communities that were most harmed and minority communities, specifically, deal with these negative impacts so that it's providing funding. Now, the language is very general in the bill about, how it's to be spent, which I think is a good thing because it will give, the opportunity to kind of really customize the funds to the needs of the communities. But one of the key things that I think has to happen is that there has to be a strong dialogue between the state and the impacted communities on how those funds can best be invested to help folks in terms of, job training, business development. A lot of key things can be done with those reinvestment funds. And that really is an important part of this in terms of kind of the restorative justice. And so I've talked a lot, which is my problem, so I'll stop there.
And Matt, Maryland, of course, is drawing from the experiences of other states, right? So like New York has been a leader on this, whereas some of the earlier states who adopted policies really didn't build this in. It's a quite insightful question because you have the practical piece of it, the expungement itself, and certainly automatic expungement is beneficial to individuals. But then what about the harm done? And these funds and the reinvestment in these communities are intended to at least attempt to address.
Yeah, and there's so many factors that need to be addressed to deal with the racist war on drugs and all of its impacts. That this bill will not solve all of these, but it can start to address some of these. But we need to draw attention to the amount of work that needs to be done. Here in Maryland, I mentioned the nationwide problem of discriminatory enforcement of cannabis laws. Maryland does better than the national average. The ACLU report that kind of analyzed this data, it said that in Maryland, if you were Black, you were 2.1 times as likely to be arrested than a white person, and that cannabis possession arrests made up 50% of the drug arrests in the state. So it's clear that while Maryland is doing a little better than the national average, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think we need to understand that Maryland is not a monolith, that the challenges are different from community to community, because we have some communities here, some counties here in the state where that arrest disparity rate is close to 9 times. A Black person would be 9 times as likely to be arrested in some communities. So I think, just drawing attention to this and really forcing the issue is important.
Leah, any perspective you want to add here?
No, I agree that, these things are important, and not only can Maryland learn from the experiences of other states, but we can learn from our own experiences, which, Matt, you talked about earlier with our medical program and moving forward with this new legislation.
Alex, I know you have more questions.
Well, I'm glad we have a scientist here because, as you might imagine, with our audience, we have got some serious science questions, and they're really pertinent, but they're science-based. I'm going to bring in Melinda to ask hers. Melinda, go ahead. Melinda, your mic's open. There you go. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. I had a question about THC caps, and I was just wondering if the panelists could share how they see the pros and cons of placing a cap on THC, since many of the harms.
I'm sorry, you're talking about the percentage of THC in the products, right?
Yeah, yes, or in the plant. I guess it could be in the plant as well,
Okay.
but also in the product. And I'm asking, since many of the harms associated with cannabis use worsen with higher potency cannabis, it just seems like it could be in the public good to cap the levels at 10 to 15%, which I think is what the Netherlands recently did. And I'm just wondering if the panelists could share what reasons there might be to not cap it.
So I'll start by just, saying that yes, the THC potency has been increasing, and that THC, does seem to be increasing. THC potency is associated with, potential negative effects. Increasing ER visits for things like acute psychotic episodes related to THC, things like cyclic vomiting syndromes that land people in the hospital with electrolyte imbalances. Increased risk of cannabis use disorder. And so these are all things that are associated with this particular cannabinoid that has these psychoactive effects. And so that's why that, just a little bit of background, that's why there is this question about, do we need to put a limit on THC concentrations? And, I think that it's a good question, and I Matt, is there a bill that is looking at that currently in Maryland?
So, looking at this issue, we've dealt with in our medical system placing THC caps on like edible products, but there's a broad spectrum of products, and I think it's the area of concentrates and extracts, as well as cannabis flower, that folks are also concerned with. And I believe in the bill, I don't know if it's in both the Senate and the House version, but in one of the versions of the bill, that basically requires the regulatory body to work with the public health. There's a cannabis public health advisory board to help, provide expertise and guide some of the science of the policy. And I think there's a mandated study to understand the risks of high concentration products and what type of limits should be put in place. Now, I've looked at other state approaches, and it's uncommon to find potency restrictions. I think there is a state or two that caps the THC concentration of flower at 35%. And I think I saw one state with a concentration limit for THC in concentrates at 70%. So it's not something where there's a lot of kind of best practices to follow, nationally, from the United States. And I think the realization is, and as was pointed out, we can look to information outside the scope of the United States to help guide these policy decisions, but it is on the radar in this reform bill. And, hopefully, Maryland can figure out a system that improves on this challenge of high potency products. But I do want to point out that states will often allow more potent products in the medical system than in the adult use system. And I think there may be a need within the medical system for some of the higher potency THC products. And I probably shouldn't be saying this with Leah here, but Leah, have you heard the discussion about this, a need for a different type of product in the medical versus the adult use?
So a consideration for having either higher caps or no caps in the medical system would be that if someone is using cannabinoids or cannabis for medical purposes, that lower THC caps on specific products would increase the burden of product necessary to reach a desired effect. And so, but again, there's we need more, research and evidence to really explore these issues and determine what's the, reality, behind those concerns.
Alex, other question.
We were talking before the program about, the different, there are several different psychoactive cannabinoids, right? And they're treated differently under the law. So I'm going to bring in Mam Gyamfi, who has a question about the different, at least three of the different cannabinoids we talked about. Go ahead, ma'am.
Everybody, I'm so happy to be here with you all. My question is to everybody. So first, last Friday, I was at a conference with various disability advocates, and one of the issues which I was pleased to see was that they were talking about medical cannabis. However, several people were saying because of the cost of cannabis products, they were going to their local gas station and other places and getting Delta 8. And then a larger number of people than I had expected were also saying that they were taking Delta 9. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit about, number one, if there is more evidence-based medicine showing on either one of those compounds. And then number two is, in terms of Maryland law and federal law, how are those dealt with? Because again, I was a little bit concerned with the extreme amount of people who were saying that was their, medicine of choice, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I'll start, Matt, and then I'm gonna.
Oh, I could talk all day about this.
So I'll just start just by saying so Delta 9 THC is what we consider to be when we say THC, a lot of times that's what we're referring to. That's the THC cannabinoid that exists in in the plant, and it's been the most studied cannabinoid of the evidence that we have. Delta 8 THC and Delta 10 THC, these are compounds that have become popular in gas stations and places like that because they can be derived from CBD that comes from hemp. That is produced, legally in accordance with the 2018 Farm Bill, and so, but this Delta 8 THC and is not it doesn't exist naturally in except maybe in trace amounts in the plant itself, and it has to be synthesized from THC, and so that process you can end up with a lot of byproducts. It's unregulated, so it's unclear how safe it is or what's actually in, if what is marketed is what's actually in these products. And I know that is the issue of Delta 8 THC and hemp-derived cannabinoids is a very complicated issue with a lot of discussion. I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about that.
Yeah, no, this I think is kind of a sleeper issue. I think it's a very important issue, and it's not getting a lot of folks talking about it because I think it's confusing. Leah pointed out that hemp became a legal agricultural product under the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, we're getting into some of the federal law problems. Well, the law said, well, FDA, you have your normal authority to regulate products made from hemp. And has the FDA done anything? No. FDA says we don't have, the adequate legal authority to do what you told us to do. So we're not getting any federal kind of guidance around the products that are made from hemp. So each state is having to figure out how to deal with the products, because when hemp was legalized as an agricultural product, they weren't thinking, they're going to be able to convert the CBD into these isomers of THC, the Delta 8s, the Delta 10s, and create intoxicating products. I've heard folks say that Delta 8 is 50% as effective to binding to the endocannabinoid system in your brain. But the levels of Delta 8 are so high in a lot of the products you see that are specifically sold for intoxication that there is a functional similarity to what's sold in the licensed market. And so it really is this challenge of these products aren't subject to federal regulation. States are just starting to determine, and we don't have like a testing, product safety testing. We don't have labeling restrictions, advertising restrictions, product, restrictions that we have on our licensed cannabis products. So that's where you're getting, at some vendors, question, products that are questionably safe. And this bill looks at this, and there's two different approaches, again, between the two bills. But one would basically say, if you want to sell any, intoxicating THC product, it's going to need to be within this license system we've created. So if you want to be a part of it, you need to apply for a license. From the kind of the retail location standpoint, but it does allow low THC products derived from hemp, but just at a very, very low level. And this has really created a lot of controversy and pushback from the kind of the hemp industry, in that, they are functioning in the economy now, and this bill would really take away some of the most profitable products they have to sell. But, the state's, looking at trying to regulate intoxicating products in a similar way.
Alex.
All right, you've touched a little bit on the problem with research and how research is limited. I'm going to bring in Darren Gilchrist, who wants to explore the future of that process. Darren, are you there? Darren, go ahead.
Okay.
There you go.
My question was, with the continued shift in the legal stance towards cannabis, I was wondering how that will impact the ability to further research in the future, and then how does that impact, how does that change the impact that new findings will have on the legislature that's being established now? Do you all foresee some legislative changes being rolled back or just modified?
I'll start with that. So it's been difficult to, conduct cannabis clinical research in the U.S. because of its regulatory status. There's a lot of, additional, regulatory requirements for people who want to obtain cannabis for research purposes. Historically, there's only been one place in the United States that grows cannabis for research.
We're up to 7 now.
We're up to 7 now. So we're up to 7. So that's something that's changing. And then there's challenges with methodology itself in conducting clinical trials, especially with psychoactive cannabinoids. But a lot of these things are changing. And then in December, the Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act became law, and so that should help to alleviate some of the regulatory challenges and also continue to improve supply issues related to getting cannabis into the hands or labs of researchers. But I think that any regulatory shifts that improve the ease of doing research with cannabis are important because as cannabis access increases and people are using it more for medical purposes, for non-medical purposes, having a better understanding of the therapeutic benefits that exist, the potential short and long-term harms is only going to come about if we're able to do more research. Matt?
Yeah, no, I second everything Leah said. I think, the basic belief that I have is that, good policy requires good science, especially if we're looking at this from a public health perspective. And so hopefully, as these policy changes occur. And, you know, up until 2021, there was only one place that you could get research cannabis. And it was in 2021 where the federal government finally started allowing additional places to grow. So we're really at kind of a point where hopefully we're going to see more momentum pick up in this area so that we better understand, you know, how to use this as medicine, how to deal with, you know, the risks and created by cannabis consumption. So really, you know, I'm looking forward to more science.
So I know we only have a couple more minutes left, and given that I'm the provost, I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask to our educators about, as educators, what should we be doing here at UMB, given the type of institution we are with, you know, health and human services disciplines, including pharmacy, including law, including social work and medicine, and so on. How should we be educating and thinking about educating our students for this new world that we're all marching into, this massive experiment that we're all dealing with, both as educators, as policymakers, as legal advocates, as health providers? How should we be thinking about educating our students?
That's a great question. Obviously, one that's very near and dear to my heart as program director, and really, you know, the foundation of cannabis science, teaching what we know about the evidence that does exist, and the policies that do exist and how they're changing. I think that anybody that is working with patients who should be able to talk about the science of cannabis, because people are using it. You know, we talked in the beginning, you know, we set the tone that, you know, the reality is that this is happening, that people are using cannabis, people want to know about cannabis. And so, you know, I would hope that as policymakers, as clinicians, as social workers, that we could learn some of this foundational information to, you know, really talk, you know, honestly and, you know, intelligently with patients about the benefits, you know, of therapeutic use, the risks of use, and what that all means for the future.
Matt, from your perspective.
So there are a couple things that I want to highlight. I think, you know, an important thing for any educator to do in this topic area is to be cognizant of your own biases. Because that's going to really inform how you look at this issue. And, you know, I spend a lot of time, you know, in Maryland and across the country talking to folks about cannabis legalization, cannabis policy, and the views run the full spectrum, you know, to the end of the world. I think I said utopian on the other side, when I think in reality, there's a mixture. There are a mixture of benefits and a mixture of risks. And we have to be honest in looking at this, that, you know, that there are both sides of that coin involved with this issue, and that it's a very complicated issue. And so to be open to learning more about this. And I think there are some great resources out there to learn more about this. I am particularly, you know, I think it's particularly important to understand the social justice and racial justice implications that cannabis policy has had and the changes will have. Because when I talk to a lot of folks, even in public health, you know, they don't really have that racial justice framework or lens when they're looking at this. And this is such a big issue that we need to wear many hats and look at it at many different perspectives. Because I think having a fuller understanding of the world of issues will really help us address the risks and benefits more effectively and advocate for smarter policy, smarter approaches to things.
Roger, I know we're out of time, but in light of that answer, I have to advocate for one of our audience members who is looking for some social justice. If we could just get her a quick pointer in the right direction. Kay Bennett. Kay, ask what your question is real quick. She's been very patient.
I'm a Black woman here in Maryland, and I'm very interested in becoming a grower. But the process that I have looked into, printed out all the paperwork, is overwhelming at best. And then in trying to find out, like, if there's a cap, it seems that at this point I've been locked out of the process, and I'm trying to find out, like, how can someone like me with limited financial network get into the process of just becoming a grower? And would that license apply to me or to my growing space?
So I'll give you some basic information. I can't give you legal advice. But in looking at this, right now, the new licensing is the application process for that is probably going to start September of this year. And it's, it's going to be, a social equity applicant lottery. So you need to determine whether or not you qualify as a social equity applicant, and there are different types of licenses that you can apply for. Now, one of the things that the agency is being tasked with is developing the application process for this new round of licenses. And there is an acknowledgement that the application process was a barrier to entry. So I think we're going to see a more streamlined, a simpler, more approachable application process. One of the things I know originally in Maryland that you needed to have was, secure the location where you were going to hold your cannabis business even before you were awarded a license. This system, the new system, is removing a requirement like this. So I think we're going to see a better application process. But if you are, if you are interested in this, there are micro cultivator licenses as a way to gain easier entry, because it's going to be, you're going to be capped at the amount of canopy space you can have. But the idea is a smaller operation is easier for folks to step into. So, think about a micro cultivator license. And part of this bill is trying to address the challenges that you've come across. And so there is going to be a loan program that focuses on getting funds to social equity applicants. There's going to be a free technical assistance program to help people become part of the industry and to succeed in the industry, because there's the realization that really the largest barriers to entry for folks who are not already wealthy and sophisticated business people. If you're new to this, you're going to need financial support, and we don't have the traditional financial support in the cannabis space because of federal law really discourages or scares banks away from providing reasonable financial services. And so the state, with these bills, is looking to step into that space to a certain degree and provide financial support to folks who are looking to start up. So, there should be technical resources coming out. It's still early. It doesn't feel early, I know, but the state is moving fast with this, with a stand-up date of July 1st for legalization, and really wanting to get that first round of new licenses, going as early as possible. But we need these the reform bill finalized so that the regulatory agencies can start to get those resources out to folks.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, an hour well spent. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to the audience for tuning in, as always. And I certainly have learned a lot, and I'm sure you did as well. So again, thank you all for tuning in.